what happens if children only speak a single language in spite of parental input in the other one? What happens then? Well, it may become impossible for these children to communicate with members of their extended family and their family friends. And that can be, even with grandma who lives in Russia. And, Skype with grandma in Russia, no longer possible because the child who lives here in the United States no longer speaks any Russian. Maybe they did when they were very young, but starting when they're age 4, when they start to go to preschool, the Russians just evaporated. So there's no relationship possible between the child and the relative, the important relatives also. And that's very sad, especially for the relatives, but also for the children. And then also, we know that communication between parents and children may be adversely affected. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Because both parents and children, and we know that from mostly research in the United States with adolescents and children, adolescents and their parents, that both parties may feel a sense of loss of identity, loss of culture, loss of emotional bonding. There are many studies actually that show this, and that it has to do with parents and children using the same language, speaking the same language to each other, but the same non-school language to each other in proficient ways, proficiently, at equal levels of proficiency also. So that is very, very important. I want to just add to this that lots of parents also feel adolescence is tough anyway. For the parents here, we know that all of us have been adolescents, and I think back and I think, oh, I'm pretty ashamed how I treated my parents as an adolescent. It's difficult for both parties. So if in addition to that you don't speak the same language to each other, it really creates this chasm. There is much less bonding going on, and parents claim that they have very little authority over their children if they cannot speak the same language, or they do not speak the same language as their children. Conversation is still possible, so the child will speak the school language and the parent will respond in the other language because it's their language and because maybe they're not so proficient in the school language, right? So it's not a good idea. And that is because language as a means of communication is highly, highly symbolic, and it relates to cultural and personal identity. And the languages, and now I'm shifting from just the home to outside the home, and the languages that children bring to school from home are usually not used there and are often entirely ignored. And this implicitly shows children, and they are already very sensitive to this when they're 4 years of age, shows that these languages are attributed less value than the school language or the school languages. And so a large part of children's cultural identities is thus ignored and not valued. And it appears as if part of them does not exist. So children also feel that they themselves are worth less. When you ignore my language, you're ignoring me as a person. When you reject my language, it's even worse. You are rejecting me as a person. And I just had, last year, I spoke in Germany, and I've spoken about this particular topic a lot, especially in Germany, to actually people who work in childcare centers. And there was a workshop also where there were a lot of highly experienced and older childcare workers. And there was one story there, because they all have experience with multilingual children in groups. There was one childcare worker who spoke Arabic, who was a German person, but who spoke Arabic. Well, of course, there's lots of German persons who speak Arabic. What I meant is she was not of Arabic heritage at all. But she was like a person, they have that too, who went and helped out at various childcare centers. There are various systems that exist there. And she came to a childcare center where a child had been, who had been there for half a year, 7 months, and who hadn't, who was very withdrawn. And she asked a little bit about the child's home environment, and was told that at home they speak Arabic. So she talked to this kid in Arabic. This kid, big smile, and after 2 days he was speaking German. And he's engaging in the classroom. This is just the power of the symbol, of the symbolism of language. And so ignoring and or disrespecting, even worse, other languages than the school language at school is not a good foundation for the fostering of children's well-being, and it hinders children's social integration. I have here another sad example from British research about a child called Smita. And Smita, she lives in the United Kingdom, and at home she hears Bengali and hardly any English. And unlike the 4 kids in my little book there, this is a case study of this particular child, a real child, yes. And at age 3, Smita speaks Bengali fluently, and she's a happy child who gets along with everybody pretty much. And at age 3.5, Smita starts attending preschool, and there everybody only speaks English. And nobody understands Bengali. And Smita understands nobody there. So she cries every day, doesn't want to go to school. At home, she seems to be depressed. Smita's parents would like for her to continue going to this preschool because they want her to learn English. They themselves don't really speak any English. And Smita says nothing at school. And there she feels excluded, not understood, and depressed. I don't think we need a really, we could ask her maybe, but it's very clear. There's a lack of well-being in this child. But just imagine, when you are a 2.5-year-old, at age 2.5, you're just starting to discover the power of language. You no longer have to scream to get what you want. You can talk about it. You can point to things and name them. And you can also, when you're 3, you can build sentences, and you can actually argue through language. There are various examples on YouTube, wonderful examples of 3-year-olds having fantastic verbal arguments with their parents, trying to convince their parents for this and that. They have, and that's how they express who they are, because they want something and they know that through talking they might change your mind and get what they want. Yes. And that's the experience children have of becoming a person and being able to express themselves through language. Then boom, in this case, like Smita, she's just gotten this idea of, I can talk, I'm doing fine. And then boom, dropped in the situation where this language thing, it doesn't work anymore. It must be so shocking. It must be so shocking. When we, as adults, go to a country where we don't speak the language, Hungarian for instance, I think most of us here don't know Hungarian. Well, we know we're not going to be able to understand what they're doing there, and we're going to try and strategize about how we're going to deal with that. But not a 3.5-year-old can't do that. So this is like a horrible, horrible experience for a 3.5-year-old. Now, at age 4.5, that's a year later. A year later, that's like a quarter of the child's life, more or less. She still isn't speaking at school. At home, she's somewhat happier again, and she makes great strides in her Bengali language development. But she still hates going to school. She tells her parents that she understands nothing of what goes on, what the teacher says. She just checks on what the others, she just looks, sees what the others are doing, and then she does the same. Otherwise, the teacher is angry. She has no friends at school because there are no other Bengali-speaking children there. And when she is 5 years of age, the teacher expresses her concern about Smita. She doubts that Smita will be able to go to primary school because, after all, Smita doesn't speak. And she's forgetting entirely that this child speaks fluent Bengali. Yeah? It's only the English that matters in the United Kingdom, in most places. Yeah, so that was one example. And by the way, I should mention that in a lot of the literature, and I must confess that I myself also, accepted that there is a silent period. This is called the silent period, the Smita. That's kind of the normal part of early second language acquisition for children who go to school, who start attending a preschool in a language that they don't have at home. I thought, that's kind of, it's portrayed as being normal. Well, that started to, it's not normal. There is a lot of variation amongst children in how long they have some kind of silent period in which they do not speak, but there's a lot of children who do, and it will probably depend on how preschool teachers handle, the fact that the child speaks another language. So maybe, but we can talk about that some later. Anyway, it's not, I don't think it's a normal or accepted, it's a horrible state of development. So let's not assume that it's normal. Okay, so here's an example from an Algerian woman who went to France eventually and wrote this because she became a psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist in France. But she reports on herself when she was young, and in the book, it's a fantastic book which I only discovered, too late, I guess. She also discusses children then in France with similar experiences. So her name is Zerdalia, and at age 3, she lived in Algeria when she was a little kid, and she attended a French-speaking school in Algiers at that time, during the colonial time still, when France was still, when Algiers was still a French colony. And she spoke Arabic at home. And on her first day at preschool, she was also only 3, she was shocked to hear her teacher mispronounce her name, and at the fact that she could not understand anything, like Smita. After a year of listening silently, also, that's a year, so it's a long time for a small child to not say anything, at school, and trying to decipher what was going on. So Daria noticed that some children received candy after they said something. She also wanted candy. And so she thought she'd figured out something to say that the teacher would like. So excitedly she got up and she said something, but she only got a cold stare back, pointing at her seat. No candy. But she was really lucky. But here, it's a linguistically determined lack of well-being. But I'm just going to say that in her second year of preschool, she had a new teacher came from France who wanted to learn Arabic. Yeah, which was made very difficult. And who came to Zerdalia's home, and Zerdalia's parents thought this was ridiculous, that the teacher came to their home, and they laughed at her for wanting to learn Arabic. But Zerdalia just fell in love with the teacher, as little children do, and life changed for her. But anyway, before that wonderful teacher, new young teacher from France, from children like Smita and Zerdalia, their lack of well-being is related to not enough understanding, that's for sure, and hence not being able to take part in class activities and learning. You can only learn if you can understand what's going on. But also, it has to do with not being understood yourself, and thus not really being recognized as a person, and feeling excluded. So linguistically determined lack of well-being at preschool occurs when, again, children don't understand the school language. Children are unable to use the language or the languages they already know to make themselves understood. Children experience an explicit rejection of a language they bring to the classroom from home, usually by the teacher, often also by the other children. Children experience that a language they bring to class from home is worth less than the school language. And also when children who try to speak the school language are implicitly rejected in their attempts to do so, and they're not being supported. As a solution, many children, so here comes the link with the big data from the survey. As a solution, many children will reject one of their home languages and will refuse to speak it. Because this happens to children also who have two languages at home, one of which is the school language. They will still feel that their other language, which is totally ignored at school, well, that means it's not worth much, right? So through doing so, rejecting one of their home languages, they hope that they will be more valued at school or preschool. Language refusal, however, as I already indicated, has a very negative effect on communication within the family, and it usually does not contribute to positive feelings in the family, because parents of 4-year-olds often feel rejected by their children because their language is being rejected. So here we are, full circle. I did write a chapter about that a few years back, pulling together data from European studies that spoke to this issue of how parents of preschool children, so parents of children under the age of 6, felt about their children not speaking their language. This was also inspired somewhat by a conversation I'd had with a very fancy woman at a fancy place in Austria somewhere, a woman I did not know, and a woman probably my age, who, people ask me, what do you do? And then I say, well, I study how children become bilingual, how they learn several languages. And this woman immediately, I've never met this person. This woman, her tears spring in her eyes. And she said, oh, it didn't work for me. I said, oh? Yeah, she said, now my children, now they speak some German. But, we lived in the United States, and I spoke German to them, and they didn't want to speak German. And they were little, and I couldn't be angry with them, but I was so sad, she said. It was so horrible. And at this moment, when she's telling me something that happened like 30 years before, because she had grown children now. She's still deeply sad because of that. So parents apparently feel this rejection at the same time. They feel, a 4-year-old, they're not doing this on purpose. But I'd already had this experience, though, with rejection, but I didn't really think about it much when I was doing my PhD, and I was, because it also works the other way. It's not always the English that wins out. I was recording also a child in Bruges in the Netherlands who was hearing Dutch from her mother and pretty much everybody else except her father, who was an American and spoke English to her. And he wasn't home very much, so he didn't spend that much time with the child, but she was 3, and when he was home in the weekends, he told me, and I had recordings of that, I knew it was true, that she only said yes and no at age 3 in English, but she spoke Dutch very well. And he said to me, oh, well, she rejects me. It's typical Freud. She's rejecting me because she doesn't want to speak my language. But that was his feeling. So he was starting to get angry at his child for not speaking his language. I also, at that time, I said, well, maybe if you talked more to her. And then he quoted Chomsky to me, and he said, no, input doesn't matter. So, because he had done translation studies in the United States, and well, he knew that was not important. But his feeling was definitely negative because his child wasn't speaking his language. Yes. So he felt also rejected, and that's not a good basis for having parent-child relationship when you feel as a parent that your child is rejecting you from a very young age. And as adolescents, as I mentioned before, children who do not speak their parents' language, the children often feel very emotionally distant from their parents. So often teachers even advise parents to stop speaking the language that is not the school language. We don't have surveys we don't have statistics on this, but we know it happens. But it does not help in learning the school language. That's somehow what people think. And it is morally unacceptable because it goes against also the United Nations Convention for Child Rights, which was ratified by most countries in the early 1990s. And this is the article that is relevant here, Article 29 in Division 1 under Division C. So the education of the child shall be directed to the development of respect for the child's parents, his or her own cultural identity, language, and values, and for the national values of the country in which the child is living, yes, the country from which he or she may originate, and for civilizations different from his or her own. So this is all being negated, and unfortunately in Flanders, there are many, many schools that really prohibit children from using any other language than Dutch at school. In the classroom, outside the classroom, there are children whose mouth is being taped over because they dared speak Turkish to a friend, for instance. Yes. So I wrote I was asked actually to write a little by a journal in Belgium, a Dutch-speaking journal on education and the law. About this issue, so I hope somebody reads it. Yeah, because it's against the United Nations Convention for Child Rights. Okay, so don't do it. And it doesn't help. It does not help. It creates an aversion in many cases also towards the school language, towards this person who's taping up my mouth, right? And on the other hand, several studies show that a higher level of proficiency in emergent bilingual children's first language, so those are the children who have just one language at home and then get their second language through preschool, that these higher levels, so the better that a child speaks the home language, that correlates with their developing proficiency in the second language, especially Adam Winsler, here not far from here at George Mason University, has shown that. He's not the only one. And we know from several studies that well-developed proficiency in two languages strengthens and supports the well-being and integration of children who are growing up bilingually. So let's help children in their bilingual path. I think that's important, by informing parents about the best ways to interact in different languages at home and furnish them with research-based advice, if they so wish, and that's one of the aims of HabelNet, the Harmonious Bilingualism Network, and I hope that by the time Gert comes, that finally the website will be up. It's a work in progress that will continuously be in progress. But we really want to do outreach that is really supported by research. There are a lot of websites which are run by individual parents who have their own experience and their experience is valid. But what's not valid is that they then claim that whatever it is that they've done as an individual family, that should be done by everybody. That's not always how it should be. And they may ignore a lot of the research or just don't know anything about it. So I'm hoping that here, this is not the only initiative, there are other initiatives as well, of course, but that we can contribute something. And what's also important is we should all, in preschools and schools, actively value. It's not enough to just recognize, but to actively value all the languages that children bring from home to school. And this is not so good, this is better. Thank you.